good afternoon, all. Thank you for staying. I'm keen for this to be a conversation. I'm keen for you to, Grant. I'm keen for you to provoke me. Tell me where you think I'm full of shit. Pressure test the pitch. Ask me really hard questions. There are spies somewhere in the back of the room and I can't see them, but what we're doing is we're collecting feedback. So actually, this is not just a Q&A, it's also an opportunity for us to, it's part of our process of gathering diverse perspectives across the sector. I don't have any questions popping up on my monitor, which is like a get out of jail free card. Let me first of all, while I'm waiting for you to put your creative juices, to get your creative juices flowing, let me first of all just acknowledge that the construct of a food and fibre vision is problematic. Looking at it from a national perspective, there's a question about whether you can put a circle around the food and fibre sector and say, look, let's have a vision at food and fibre sector level, or whether visions need to be at national level in order to create alignment. Looking at it from the other perspective, there's a question about, the trouble is if you're trying to create a vision that captures forestry and dairy and sheep and beef and horticulture, the tension is that you start to lose relevance at sector level. And so this whole concept of having a vision is useful only, or is useful to the extent that it can be the basis to create pan-sector strategies and alignment through the system. So it is an alignment mechanism. How is the PSC working with the Interim Climate Change Committee to set a coherent strategy? Look, it's not just the Interim Climate Change Committee. There are a myriad of working groups, whether it's in the climate change space, whether it's in the water space, whether it's in the biodiversity space, whether it's the Productivity Commission, and most of you will have seen their low emissions economy report. So there are a myriad of groups. There is also enormous activity underway in the sector, in the dairy sector, in the sheep and beef sector, in the horticulture sector. There's an enormous amount of activity. Now, a really important idea is that the Primary Sector Council is not indulging itself by giving advice to sectors, nor are we getting involved directly in the emissions conversation, nor are we getting involved in the nitrate leaching conversation. We have a narrow brief, and it's about a vision for the New Zealand primary sector, and it's about the strategic implications of that vision. So the answer to that question is we're not. We're allowing them to go about their work, and they'll do that work. One of the challenges is that there's likely to be quite a bit of policy coming out in the next 12 to 18 months, and it's about the sector preparing and organising itself in that context. What is the PSC's approach? Acceptance or otherwise of technology like GE within the New Zealand's primary sector? Okay, geez, who asked that? Let's just talk about GE for a second. So, first idea is that the New Zealand primary sector doesn't have a pan-sector view on GE. If you look across organisations in the sector, there's a myriad of different perspectives. If you look across sectors, there's a myriad of different perspectives. I would argue that that's nonsense. That is not good enough. That is a failure of leadership. That what is required is for the sector to create an ecosystem which enables it to have a pan-sector view on GE and to be able to articulate that view in a high-quality way, in a way that aligns and optimises New Zealand's national interest. If the sector cannot form a pan-sector view on GE, then it's certainly not the role of the Primary Sector Council, which has a mandate only from the Minister of Agriculture and not from the sector itself, to express a view in that regard. Our view, we acknowledge that there is a policy framework in place, that policy framework acknowledges GE technologies to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. There is one example of that already, as some of you will be aware, in the medical sector. So we acknowledge that's the current framework, and other than having a view that the sector should have a view, we're not going to enter that debate directly. If we did that, that would overshadow all of the rest of the work that we're doing. Once the vision is developed, how are you going to mobilise farmers and producers in support of it? So, I'm going to come back to this idea of having an ecosystem that enables leadership. And I just want to recognise the magnitude of the challenge. To be, and I'm going to use one of my slides. To be successful, I'll use this one. To be successful, we're going to have a pan-sector view of what the broad direction is and what's important to us at values level. In our view, we're going to need to have the most sustainable farming systems globally. We're going to need to optimise land use choices, and by the way, that means the biggest impediment to optimising land use choices is farmers having something more economically valuable to farm. And so that's an investment challenge as much as anything else. It's also a huge opportunity. We're going to need an optimised science, education and commercialisation system. We're going to need supporting regulation. We're going to need aligned investment. Now, what I've just outlined is a 20-year program of optimal policy and strategy and aligned investment. The challenge is enormous. Now, the question is, how can we create an ecosystem which allows not just the dairy sector, but dairy and sheep and beef and horticulture and fishing and forestry to develop high-quality policy that is relevant from a pan-sector perspective, and to partner and support the government to implement that policy over time in a way that society can understand and support. So we're talking about the development of an ecosystem that enables intentional leadership, and we are a mile away from that today. Now, every time we try and do something at pan-sector level in the sector, it's really, really hard. We don't play well together. It feels to us like the interests of dairy and the interests in sheep and beef farmers and the interests in forestry are far away from each other. But strategically, they absolutely relate. And so there are examples in other countries around the world where they're doing a much better job in this space than what we are. So the first challenge is to get our act together with pan-sector leadership, from a pan-sector leadership perspective. And then the next challenge is to really partner effectively with government to deliver that. Now, once we've done all of that, and we've got optimal policy, that will open up opportunities for our farmers. And the interesting things about farmers is they're not scared of change. Farmers are absolutely up for the change and will support the change, but it's got to be pragmatic, it's got to be sensible, it's got to be supported with good tools, there needs to be supporting investment, there needs to be capability available, and so it's about linking up all of those parts. And so that's, in the end, asking farmers to support something that they can't see, isn't coherent and isn't well supported, doesn't make a lot of sense. People need confidence in order to invest. Origin Green and Ireland is a national food and fibre enviro welfare benchmarking system. Do we need a similar framework? If it gets managed, if it gets measured, it gets managed. Couldn't agree more. There's not much more for me to say in that space. That's absolutely right. We do need something like that. We need the New Zealand version of that. It's critical that we have it. Once the vision is developed, how are you going to mobilise farmers and producers in support of it? We've had that already. I don't propose to talk more about it. Got anything more provoking? We want to have origin green, but we're getting paid more for our produce anyway. What's the point? Was that sort of the question? Yep. One of the ideas is that I talked about this unrelenting pressure from an environmental sustainability perspective. Whenever you're developing strategy, it's really important to take a view of how the future is going to play out. We can see, when we look into the future, the environmental pressure that's confronting us today, and we can anticipate that that will become more extreme. We can see enormous investment into different food production systems, partly as a reaction to what's happening environmentally. So I'm talking about plant-based proteins, I'm talking about synthetic foods. So we can see enormous investment in that space. The strategic question which confronts us is, what is New Zealand's positioning in the context of that change? Now, I think I would argue that it is most unlikely that New Zealand is going to become a global leader in synthetic foods, or even a global leader in plant-based proteins, because most of that game will be a commodity game. So the question is, where can we lead? And I think there's a cogent argument to say, well, look, the leadership opportunity for us is to lead in sustainably produced, high-quality nutrition. And that means dairy, and that means meat, and it means apples, and it means kiwi fruit, and it means fantastic seafood, and it means naturally produced fibres. And so how can we win? What is our positioning? And so that our richness, the richness of our natural capital and our low population density provides a strategic opportunity for us to do that. Now, if you're going to try and play that game, if that's going to be your niche, you're not selling to the commodity market, you're selling to the high value market. And if you're going to sell to the high value market, you better be producing sustainably, because anything else will not support your positioning. And so, so you can say, well, unless we get a premium, what's the point? But you won't get a sustainable, strong return for your product unless you jump that hurdle. So it's about alignment through the strategy. The primary sector vision is going to be quite high level and a motherhood and apple pie from what I can see. The strategy would appear to be would be the more important piece. How are we going to get from our current position to where we want to be? Can you not give us a bit of insight into what the key strategy will actually look like? Well, so some really important ideas around that. First of all, I actually agree with you. I think this is all about aligned strategy and high quality implementation over time, and the actual wording of the vision on the one hand is hugely important, but it's actually not where the value is added. So the vision is just part of an alignment system. I do agree with you that ultimately it's the strategies that will deliver the value, and importantly, it's the alignment through the system of strategies. Because if you can think of strategy as strands, say examples, you can talk about safe food, you can talk about excellence in nutrition. You can talk about a provenance story. You can talk about our sustainability, our credentials as being very sustainable farmers. You can talk about optimal land use. The thing about this sort of strategy is you need to do all of it to a very high standard in order to unlock the value that's required. It's not simple, it's nuanced, it's not glossy, it requires consistent, detailed implementation day in, day out, year in, year out. That's what this takes. Now, interestingly, and then people at enterprise level, what you do is you create a system where they can succeed, within which they can create a competitive advantage. And so a really important idea, and I'll get into some nuts and bolts to give you so you can sort of feel it a little bit better. We've got $8 billion plus businesses in New Zealand. Food and fibre businesses, pine trees, wild caught fish, dairy, sheep meat, beef meat, kiwi fruit, apples, grapes, or wine. We've got $8 billion plus businesses in New Zealand. To continue to grow, some of those $1 billion plus businesses need to perform and need to go strongly. Probably we need to add 1 or 2 or 3 billion dollar plus businesses. And those businesses, because growth has got to come from somewhere, and dairy is potentially constrained. So what businesses are going to grow? And which businesses are going to be constrained? And what businesses that aren't $1 billion plus today are going to become $1 billion plus? And what supporting regulation and what investment are we going to put in place to ensure those businesses do grow? Because I promise you something, they will not grow organically. They're not going to grow by chance. We need to be intentional about this. Now, the people from the Treasury get cross because they say you can't pick winners. In my view, that's nonsense. You absolutely have to back industries to grow. It's how everyone else in the world does it. It's how we should be doing it. It's absolutely about intentionality. Now, I've just described one particular strand around optimal land use or around identifying growth businesses in New Zealand. The trouble is there's 15 of these strands, and we need to optimise all of them, and we're a mile away from doing it today because we're short of investment dollars, we lack scale, we're far too politically correct, we do not take a proactive enough approach in this space. And so once you create an ecosystem which enables leadership to be taken, you create the potential for the delivery of value. How do we support land use class 5, 6, 7 communities going forward with land changing to more forestry, less rural employment with robotics, etc.? Now that's a tough question. And it's a tough question because if you look, so let's just understand the numbers. And I'm going to say something a little bit provoking, and if there's rural people in the room, you might beat me up. Let's just understand the numbers. 14 million productive hectares, 8.5 million hectares in sheep and beef country, 1.5 to 2 million hectares of that and some sort of trees, 1.7 million hectares in plantation forestry, 1.7 million hectares in dairy, 450,000 hectares in high value, cropping, 70,000 hectares in high value horticulture if you include wine. I'm not saying we shouldn't. Now, the reason when we talk about that sheep and beef country, one of the inherent challenges, 8.5 million hectares in sheep and beef country. That land on average produces less than $1,000 a hectare at the export line, and you don't farm sheep and beef for free. That average isn't useful because it's an amalgam of very, very poor returns from some marginal country and much, much stronger returns from some better country. When you go to our rural towns today, when you're talking about marginal sheep and beef country, those communities are already hollowed out. And the hollowing out process has been ongoing for 30 years. People have been leaving towns, schools have been closing, post offices have been closing, communities have been hollowing out. Young people don't stay in those communities because of the lack of education. So what are we talking about with the problem with forestry when it comes to does it support our communities? There's enormous passion associated with our way of life, but when you're talking about strategy, you've got to focus on the right factors. So if the problem is robust rural communities, we've already got that problem, and trying to stand in the way of change doesn't fix that problem. Forestry is not necessarily a particularly high quality answer. Here's another group of people I'll annoy. Forestry makes $3,000 a hectare at the export line on an annualised basis. If you look at it over the last 20 years, $3,000 a hectare, it's not free to grow pine trees. Nor is it a sustainable answer to our carbon emissions problem, because pine trees do not grow forever and eventually they have to be harvested. It is a temporary answer to the sustainability issue while we do other things to reduce our emissions, and that challenge is enormous. But forestry is part of the mix, and resisting that conversation around forestry for the wrong reasons is not a strong answer. So I've just given you a very direct response to a very provoking issue which people are very passionate about. One of the things, and I've got one final comment to make about this, the context has changed. The planet is on fire. We're on our way to 3 degrees. There is enormous urgency around climate change. It is not an optimal situation. It is not an optimal situation. We need to address it with urgency, and some of it is going to be a little bit messy, and that is going to upset people, and that is tough, because if we fail to address it, that is worse. And so what I've just done is articulated the passion and the urgency around climate change. You know from earlier today, I articulated the passion and anxiety around not driving our farmers out of business, because that is not a sustainable answer either. There was a primary sector science strategy completed 2 years ago, a good piece of work, but it has gone nowhere with the change in government. So how will this PSC initiative be any different? Well, first of all, just let me acknowledge that the primary sector science strategy was completed 2 years ago. It was an excellent piece of work in my view. The science priorities were not sharply prioritised enough relative to the strategy. That work is just being reviewed at the moment. We need to be very, very focused about where we spend our science money. How will this PSC initiative be any different? It won't necessarily. There's 120 of these advisory groups. The only way it's going to be any different is if my colleagues and I, and there are 16 outstanding people on that group, is if my colleagues and I can engage with primary sector leaders across the country and convince them to create the ecosystem that empowers intentional leadership that I'm talking about, because we do not have it today, and without that enabling structure, without that enabling ecosystem, we're going nowhere particularly fast. Government can partner with us in that space, but in the end, the leadership must come from business. Government has come up with many strategies, for example, the New Zealand Health Strategy. But since it is a holistic, as a necessity, everyone interprets it differently, and nothing gets moving. Also, with executives and ministers changing constantly in short terms, agendas change and momentum is constantly lost. How will this be any different? Such a good question. I hate the 3-year election cycle. Quick show of hands. How many people would prefer a 4-year election cycle? Holy crap, isn't it weird that we can't get that up? It's just so weird. Okay, and so a really important idea, and it's something that I'm sort of wrestling with from a design perspective, is where is the impetus owned? Now, because of the issues that you raise, my instinct is that the impetus, the sort of the control of this ecosystem needs to have high ownership by business, because business is actually more enduring than the government of the day. That's not good enough. That's nice in principle, but actually one of the things that happens is you just get underway, you get a bit of momentum going, there's a government change, the new minister doesn't like it, doesn't resource it, and you fall over again. And so the question is, can we create a construct which enables high ownership by business, but which is protected by legislation in a way that makes it more difficult for the incoming government to meddle with? Now, I'm not sure of the answer to that. We need to study it. But actually, a really important idea is when you're creating an ecosystem, and let's just be clear, we have an ecosystem today. It's just inadequate to the challenge ahead of us. When we're creating an ecosystem, when we're doing that design, the idea of building sufficient robustness in it so that you can develop and maintain momentum is enormously important. So that's a design challenge. I look forward to being able to answer it with some semblance of quality. At a guess, the PSC will encourage movement towards high value consumer goods. Will the PSC provide some views or ideas on how we access the capital requirements for this type of food and fibre production? Oh my gosh, what a topical conversation. Have you heard the banks at the moment? Geez, they're sulking, aren't they? After the Reserve Bank said you guys might need a bit more capital. Oh my gosh, they're so grumpy. Are there any bank people here? Do I have to hide after this? Look, really good question, and you're absolutely right. We do think, so one of the ideas about this 2% growth is that it's hard to achieve, and value growth is an important part of that. Growing margin in business is one of the hardest things to do. Everyone talks about growing margin, but actually it's really, really hard because margins shrink as a function of competition, left to their own devices. Growing margin is really, really hard. Often in New Zealand, there's this sort of belief that the way you grow margin is you try and move down the value chain, that you try and, that it's about marketing, it's about telling a good story, that it's about perhaps being in market to sell your products directly. And so there's this idea that the high value journey is about getting closer to the consumer and getting closer to the customer. And that might be part of the opportunity for some products and value chains. But our food and fibre value chains are almost all linked value chains. That's to say you have producers and you have processors and you have exporters and you have importers and you have wholesalers and you have retailers and ultimately you have consumers. Of course, there's now e-commerce models as well, but they're not different than that. They're just using different platforms. Those linked supply chains in agribusiness exist for very good reasons. It's about where things are geographically, it's about capability, it's about investment profiles and risk profiles. And vertical integration is something to be undertaken only with extreme caution and for very, very good reasons. When we talk about high value in the differentiation sense, I'm going to develop a differentiated consumer proposition. You need some basis of differentiation. And when you're looking for some basis of differentiation, very often in agribusiness, that basis of differentiation is actually on the supply end. It's not on the market end. And so that leaves you dealing with yield, it leaves you dealing with quality, it leaves you dealing with taste, it leaves you dealing with food safety, it leaves you dealing with the rate of innovation on the supply end and with your sustainability characteristics. And it's not necessarily about saying we're going to move downstream. A really, really important idea is if we're going to go on the high value journey, we need to be really good at it because it's hard. You need to have a sustainable basis of differentiation, and bluntly, we're not very good at it in New Zealand. Almost all of our exports are sold on a commodity basis. We've got a significant journey to undertake. Governance quality is crucial. Is it possible that this long-term vision and ecosystem may hinder agility and innovation? Of course it's possible. Look, I think so. So two things are true. If you have a really good ecosystem, it should empower businesses to get on and do what they have to do. It shouldn't impede businesses. Look, I think it's possible that it'll impede agility and innovation, but I also think it's possible that it'll be inherently enabling. Are you trying for cross-party political support to avoid the whole vision being thrown out at the next election? Absolutely, it's why the PSC should be dead. So the PSC so the Primary Sector Council came into existence in April last year. It'll wink out of existence in April next year. It's a very constrained construct. It's a creature of this coalition government. It's comprised of 16 wonderful, 15 and me, wonderful, fantastic members, but we don't have a representational mandate. We're not the chairman of Dairy New Zealand and the president of Federated Farmers. We are, citizens from around the place. And so, a really important idea is that the leadership of the sector should sit where it should sit, which is in mandated organisations from the farming sector. And so, look, PSC is not fit for purpose. Not because we're not wonderful, just because the construct is constrained. Who makes up the PSC? There we are. Where are we? My slide has disappeared. We disappeared it. So there's 16 of us. We're not representative. I'm sorry, my slide is gone. There's 16 of us. We're not representative. We come from across the sector. We're underweight dairy. We're underweight sheep and beef, and we know it. Sorry, I can't give you the specific names. My slide has disappeared. The average age of farmers is increasing. How do we motivate young farmers to uptake these strategies with limited on-farm input and capital? Really, really good question. And a key challenge for the sector. We're farming at a really interesting time in the sense that returns are quite strong in many sectors, but confidence is quite low because of the change ahead of us. And that lack of confidence is undermining investment intentions. It's also no longer trendy to be a farmer. And we've got representational challenges. Arguably, the farming sector's position in New Zealand society has never been weaker. And so we're not a very attractive place for young people to want to be. My personal view is that creating an environment that young people are attracted to is about getting our positioning right as a cornerstone stakeholder in New Zealand society, creating a sector that's committed to our national purpose in a way that we can be proud of in the farming sector and that our young people can be proud of, articulating a vision and strategy that allows people to be confident that there's a career for them, that there's a wealth that can be developed into the future. And if we can do all of those things, then young people will be delighted to be part of our sector. But it's hard work. It's not as sexy as some of the other sectors. But I think we would all recognise that we have a bit of a crisis on our hands in that regard. How do we get everyone working together to achieve the vision? Oh my gosh, the vested interests are enormous. And so that can be at sector level, that can be industry good organisations. And so all I would say is that the context is changing. It's never been more urgent. If there was ever a need for us to pull together and head in a common direction, it's now. And in talking to farmers around the country, my sense is that they know that there is this sense of urgency, that there's a conviction that we need to get moving. And so sometimes, this has been tried before, and it's been tried time and time and time again. That we've talked about pan-sector bodies and we've talked about sector visions, and we always fall back to Dairy New Zealand and Sheep and Beef and Horticulture New Zealand because that's the natural resting place. But as I say, the context is different this time. It's a challenge for us to work together. It's always really hard. But my sense is that people are up for a bit of change because they're aware of the challenge we have ahead of us. The value of some farms are propped up by externalities like water availability and shielding from the true environment cost. Gosh, you're not pulling your punches. How do we reconcile that some farming systems will need complete restructuring, and who will pay? That is such a good question, and I think it's one of the key challenges ahead of us. In particular, the climate change issue has enormous urgency associated with it. On the other hand, farmers need time to adjust their farming systems. Now, the only way you reconcile those two perspectives, capability is a key constraint, capital is another key constraint. but we don't get to deal. And so, look, there are mechanisms. And so you imagine if this whole country was committed to go on a journey and the farming sector was part of that, and this was about government and farmers working in partnership together to make the transition in a way that farmers didn't lose their land. Now, when you're having that conversation, you create the potential to talk about financial partnerships and mechanisms that enable the transition to be funded. But we don't even have that conversation today because we don't have an agreed direction. And so I recognise the question. I think it's enormously important, but our first job is to support a broad direction, to enable a leadership mechanism. Then we can come to the table and we can have conversations that are about enabling actual progress. Go ahead. Yeah. So a question about the place and scale and foreign investment in the strategy. So foreign direct investment, and you know, we can look around the place and we can see that ANZCO is 100% owned by the Japanese. We can see Silverfern Farms now 50% owned by the Chinese. We've seen Westland Milk just bought by Yili. We can see Turners and Growers owned by Baiwa, most of the wine industry, at least the processing part of it, and significant vineyards are owned by offshore interests. And so already we have a huge amount of offshore investment in our industry. One of the reasons that that's true is very often our co-ops or our local businesses are starved of capital, they're going broke. And so that creates the opportunity for foreign capital to come in and participate, and we need that capital in order to go forward. My view is that we do have legitimate sovereignty interests, and that one of the reasons that we desperately need to optimise our food and fibre sector strategy is because it's only by having profitable businesses that we will retain the right to ownership. We are on a slippery slope. The level of foreign investment will continue to grow unless we can rejuvenate our strategy. I'm not anti-FDI, I want to be absolutely clear about that. I think it has its place, but when we are losing control of our businesses because we're going broke, that's a different conversation. Great work with the vision. Are there grassroots organisations ready to pick up the baton? Can rural leaders with 900 Nuffield and colleague alumni contribute here? And can we meet up later? Absolutely. And what this is about is it's about the sector owning the vision. It's about leaders across the sector at whatever level picking this up and breathing energy into it. And so, you know, I'm hugely excited by that conversation. One of the opportunities that we have as a sector is we're actually really, really tightly networked. Many of us know each other. And if we decide to do something, we'll do it, right? It's just a matter of us deciding to do it. And my sense is we're on the cusp of that. How do you see regional strategies designed to grow the primary sector aligning with the national strategy and sector strategies? I think they're overwhelmingly important. And one of the things you see, particularly in the likes of France and Italy, is you see the powerful contribution that provenance and regions can make to brands, and the ecosystems and the critical mass that they can create around industries. I'm really excited about some of the thinking here in Canterbury. I think there are other regions in New Zealand, and I'd single out the Hawke's Bay as an example of it, where I think we are already seeing that strategy in action. I think we've got a lot further to go. I think it's a really, really important part of the future. I think I'm done. 1 minute 42 before I was scheduled to be off the stage. No more questions coming through. Thank you very much for taking the time to have the conversation. I really appreciate it. Towards the middle of this year, we'll be meeting up with with the Minister and very senior food and fibre sector leaders to talk about creating the ecosystem I've been rabbiting on about. Oh, I've got another one over here, and so hopefully we'll be able to get some progress underway. Hi. Oh, I thought I was escaping. You are so right. So the question was, for those of you who didn't hear, how are we planning to engage with New Zealand as a whole? Because actually they are a critical part of this, of our ability to get traction. Look, that was my comment about. I'm concerned about a food and fibre sector strategy vision. I wonder whether what we actually need is a New Zealand vision, or at least aspects of it that we can coalesce around, and then the sector can take a leadership role in that. And when you're doing this sort of work, the only way to do it is to do it. I'm going to go to the vision. The only way to do that is to sort of build it up and deal with your core audience first. And so if we could get to a point where we had a sense of conviction and coherence within the sector, I think what that does is it creates the opportunity then to take a leadership role across New Zealand society and say, hey, here's what we're thinking about. Now let's talk, for instance, with the tourism sector to see what they're talking about, and really look at something overarching at national level. Personally, I think from a nation-building perspective, we would take a huge step forward if we could start having a conversation that was meaningful for all New Zealanders. Just bearing in mind that we're only 50% of emissions, right? And so we actually need to engage the whole country in this environmental effort. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time to catch up this afternoon.
There we go. Hi, Lain. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. We were sitting out back marveling at how well you dealt with the way that the questions came through, and with this wide variety of curiosity that's coming your way. It is not a small challenge you have undertaken, and I respect and applaud you for embracing it wholeheartedly. Thank you so much. Lain Jager, everyone.